As a system, we've begun to speak about inclusive design. We know that we cannot speak about school improvement, about student achievement, or well-being without talking about the identities of the students we serve. In particular, we have to think about and be aware of the students who are most marginalized in our schools and in our system, traditionally and currently. Once we know this, we have to then adopt an anti-oppressive stance in order to be able to serve them well. You've heard about that in an earlier video. So what is inclusive design? Inclusive design is a holistic approach that supports the school improvement planning process. It is not new, but it builds on the work that we as a system have already been doing, and it is grounded in culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. This is the work that has been happening in our school and in our system for a long time, and is based on the work that we know and we do every single day. What it does differently is it pulls the work together and it puts identity right on the table. It also supports parallel governance and self-determination for Indigenous peoples and upholds the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliations Report number 62 and 63. Here in the TDSB, we turn to the Aboriginal Education Center for guidance and support. Inclusive design honors the identities, social locations, families, cultures, languages, abilities, gifts, and potential that all students bring to our classrooms and schools. The most important thing about an inclusive design approach is that we must put students at the center. We have to think about how do we respond to the identities, the voices, and the agency of our students. So how do we draw on the voices and realities of our students to make responsive programming decisions? We must know about the identities of the students in our classrooms and schools, and in particular, we must know who is most marginalized amongst them. Conversations about school improvement, about achievement, or well-being must take into consideration the identities, the abilities, and the lived experiences of our students. And we know that when we begin by centering the most marginalized voices, that what is necessary for some will be good for all. Some of the questions around responding to student voice that we should consider include: how do we draw on the voices and realities of our students to make responsive programming decisions? How do we encourage and support student voice? How do we ensure that the curriculum is inclusive and includes a variety of worldviews, knowledge, as a basis for instruction? And how do we ensure that students have input into decisions? The next thread, building leadership capacity, asks us to consider how are we planning intentionally to build a collective capacity of our students, staff, and community. We must focus on building leadership capacity in order to create the conditions necessary to support improving access, opportunities, and outcomes for students who have traditionally been or are currently in the gaps. This requires brave conversations that can occur that would include talking about biases, barriers, power, and privilege, and how that plays a role in the outcomes that students may encounter. Most importantly, we have to be willing to talk about our own identities in relation to the identities of the children we serve, and how this may impact the ways we address issues that affect students. We must also acknowledge equity as a leadership competency, as an area of expertise, and to think about how this impacts our hiring practices, how we think about how we lead, how we think about the way we do things in our school, about assessment practices, about discipline. All of these things are a part of how we build our equity leadership competency. And when we do this through shared leadership, it will allow us to change outcomes and transform the circumstances to allow our students to be more successful. When considering building leadership capacity, some of the questions we need to ask are: how are we planning in our classrooms and schools in a way that builds the collective capacity and leadership of our students, staff, and community? And who are the leaders in our schools? For designing instruction, how can we ensure that programming is authentic and reflects the lived experiences, identities, and abilities of students? We have to consider, what are we teaching, whose voices are missing, and how can we change that? Learning in TDSB classrooms have to take into consideration the identities of our students. That means that learning should be culturally relevant and responsive. It also needs to take into consideration the abilities of our students, which requires us to use universal design for learning. And in order to attend to the varied lived experiences all across our schools and our board, we have to think about social justice inquiry, because that allows students to enter wherever they are, whatever their lived experiences, from kindergarten all the way through to grade 12, including our English language learners, to help them understand how their learning will allow them to transform themselves and the world that they're moving into. Learning in our classrooms must occur in dynamic spaces that allow students global competencies to develop. When students are engaged in these dynamic spaces, behaviors go away and their sense of well-being and purpose increases, and so does that of staff. In these environments, digital tools for learning are used to support students' learning experiences, to help them learn how to critically reflect and respond, and also to know when to connect or disconnect. These are all important things that students need to learn in our classrooms. In these spaces, there are high expectations for all students and sound assessment and evaluation practices. Rethinking ideas about the classroom becomes critical, so it's not confined to the four walls of the actual physical classroom, but it lends itself to the wider environment and to the world in which we live. In this way, students can connect to the land, understand their responsibilities as stewards of the environment, and the roles that they need to play as global change agents. As educators, we would be constantly reflecting on how our own identities inform our understanding of lesson planning and creation, assessment, discipline, and even how we define success. Learning in our classrooms should support students' global competencies and allow them to acquire the skills and knowledge that will enable them to challenge unjust practices and to build positive and healthy relationships among their peers and in society. As we think about designing the instruction, here are some questions for us to think about. How can we ensure that the programming is authentic and reflects the lived experiences and abilities of our students? What are we teaching? Whose voices are missing, and how do we change that? How do we ensure that students acquire the skills and knowledge that enable them to challenge unjust practices, to build positive and healthy human relationships among their fellow students and among all members of society? As we think about establishing the environment as the third teacher, what does our environment say about how we value our learners and communities along with the processes of learning? Inclusive design interrupts the traditional way we think about the environment to acknowledge that everything a child sees, hears, feels, experiences is in fact a part of the curriculum. The environment must acknowledge the lived experiences and identities of children in the class, in the building, as well as global diversity. This further helps students to develop their global competencies as we prepare them for life in a global context. So we are constantly thinking about our libraries and learning commons, about the books that are in there, the speakers we bring into our schools, about the posters and the things that we celebrate, the signage around the building, how students are greeted, the trips we take them on, how all of these things reflect our most marginalized learners, so that we begin with them in mind and we continue to build excellent learning opportunities for all students. We are constantly thinking about what are the social and physical barriers to access, and constantly thinking about how we can change that to make the school a much more accessible space. Some of the questions that I want you to consider are: what does the environment of our school say about how we value our learners, communities, and the process of learning? What are the physical barriers to access? Are there social barriers to access? How do we support student engagement opportunities? Do we see diversity and equity represented widely in terms of the languages, in terms of the images, in terms of everything that is happening in the school? When we think about engaging our parents, families, elders, and communities, how do our schools reflect, uphold, honor, and reflect the voices of families in local and global contexts? George Day's work reminds us to think about schools as sites for community development. Debbie Pusher's work reminds us that educators are visitors on the landscapes of schools. So how we think about our roles in relation to the communities that we serve is a critical part of inclusive design. The ways that we think about engagement is going to be critical, and it should not be limited only to school council. Parents and families are in fact holders of wisdom and should be equal partners in what is happening for their children, because they also have insight and experience and expertise in what is best for their children. So how can we think and partner collaboratively and transparently in a way that we can transform how we engage with our families beyond the ways that we already have? And do we understand how our own privilege and biases inform how we see, engage, and interact with families? Some of the questions that I encourage you to think about are: how do our classrooms and schools honor the voices and lived realities of parents, families, and community members in local and global contexts? How do we ensure families have input into the codes, decisions, and directions? How do we ensure that the school environment is welcoming for all? When we think about analyzing data, how do we know who our students in our school and classrooms are? Who's successful and who is underserved? Do we understand the role of our own identities when we're interpreting data? What do we even consider as data? As a board, we are rich with data. But what's more important is that we have to try and think about how we interrupt patterns for students who have been traditionally and/or currently underserved. So the data should be a tool to be able to support us to interrupt things that have been happening and to think about how we might transform it in a way that will better serve all of our students. Some questions that we should think about include: how well do you know who your students are and how they are experiencing school? Do you know the patterns of success? Who and where are students being underserved? What questions are you not asking? How do we ensure that we have included all our students in our data? How do we engage in conversations about bias and who is achieving and not achieving? Do we employ a variety of assessment strategies as well as instruments used to inform short and long-term planning in order to reduce gaps in student achievement and improve student learning and well-being? Finally, an inclusive design approach allows us to put our school goals in the middle and to interrogate them using the 6 threads. What that's going to do is it's going to help us understand what we're already doing and what else needs to happen. Our school achievement and well-being goals should have an embedded equity thread in it. And the equity goal in all of our schools is not about anything that we're going to do to or for anyone else. In fact, the equity goals for our schools should be about the adult learning that needs to happen in order to be able to achieve our achievement and well-being goals. Our equity goals should be about understanding our own identities in relation to the identities of the students that we're serving. We will know that we're having success when we begin to see that the gaps are closing, when there's more proportional representation of what is happening in the school with success or with failure or with discipline with regards to the students who are in our schools and in our system. So really what we're doing now is we're taking all this good work that we have been doing for many years, pulling it together, putting student identity at the center, and asking ourselves some questions to be able to identify what we're doing well, what we need to do next. This is the way we will begin to close gaps and serve all of our students in the best way possible. As we think about an inclusively designed space, I want you to reflect on the following quote and think about what resonates for you. Every student deserves to learn in conditions that support their well-being and achievement. We know that this is not always the case. But we also know that when learning conditions are optimal, when the culture is equitable and inclusive, the environment is welcoming and respectful of all, the expectations for each and every student are high, and all students see their own lived experience reflected in the classroom and the curriculum, then improved achievement and well-being for each and every student is the outcome. Please discuss this quote as a table group and see what resonates for you.